One of the videos that you did with the Stoa, which was great. You went into kind of this, and we can get into some of these other things, but I want to key in on the 5 logical fallacies. You brought up some other stuff, and so now we're kind of vaguely getting into this intellectualism, anti-intellectualism, and so maybe I think the heuristics is a good segue into these 5 logical fallacies. And maybe we can go through each one very quickly and then kind of give a good example. But willful ignorance, whataboutism, contrarianism, denialism, and self-deception. So like willfully ignorant, like I think that's almost like a de facto like cultural thing, is that now we've bred a culture of willfully ignorant people, and then that has downstream effects and stuff like that. And we were just kind of talking on that. So I guess that'll be a good starting point.
Yeah, actually, those are those are perfect examples of heuristics for the purposes we're talking about,
Right.
Intellectualism, reflexivity. And a lot of that comes from, I'll just say like the new atheism movement, right? Kind of popularized a lot of that rationalism. And like a lot of people, I was part of that at the time.
Sure.
As you said, you wanted to like go into IDW and Game B territory, and as it relates to the Stoa and my talk, like all of this stuff is connected.
Sure.
And so, my point in that article was partly to, very quickly retread some of the old rationalism that's come before, to distinguish between, what's true and what's not true. And the problem is you see the IDW committing a lot of those fallacies, like whataboutism or willful ignorance. And a lot of the discourse around the intellectual dark web has been very divisive, right? So you have the critics, and then you have them really having a lot of hegemony in public discourse. But I think it's so hard to pin down what is intellectual at the end of the day. That was part of what I was getting at. But at the same time, the IDW is such a clear-cut case. If you look at it objectively, if you're not deeply involved or committed to it, you can see the kind of hypocrisies manifesting. Like they're first and foremost kind of free speech advocates, but then they're literally trying to silence activists and critics and teachers even that are trying to teach critical thinking, critical approaches to things. Which so nothing today, because it's salient, nothing is more anti-intellectual than this reaction to critical race theory.
Right. I mean, even recently, did you see DeSantis, the governor of Florida, just signed the bill, basically like you have to basically say what your political leanings are. And it's like, whether that's constitutional or not, whether that's like whatever, it's like, that is hilarious and ironic. The fact that these free speech advocates, that this should be the rallying cry of rallying cries. If you were like had the coherence of the argument that you've been putting forth, but then that's what we get to the discourse of like, well then is it just more education on more and more people seeing these things than being able to call them out? Because it just seems like they're still doing it because they can do it, because there's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of, prestige, power, etc. Because these aren't people that are just, off the block. I mean, Jordan Peterson, he has a following. Sam Harris has a following. Joe Rogan, all these people have a following, so.
And Steven Crowder has a huge following.
Yeah.
And I
and that debate with Sam Cedar, oh my God, what is going on? Yeah.
Yeah. and so a point I want to drive home along these lines is that, very much a lot of what we validate or behold as public discourse is not actually like transparent. It's not talking about the thing it thinks it's talking about. Right. So all of the hysteria around critical race theory, that's not what it's about. It's about something else. And so the best heuristic takes of that are not to oversimplify, but the best takes are like, well, this is really just a manifestation of deep kind of racial inequality and anxiety around racism and talking about racism, nothing new, right?
Yeah.
But that while that's true, that doesn't get through to anybody. It's not received as a persuasive argument. And I mentioned Crowder because it's because it's on my mind, and he does have a huge following. But it's so interesting. You know, I watched Majority Report and Crowder in the days after, kind of looking at how both sides reflected and what the fallout was, right? And they're basically saying the same thing about each other.
I can imagine so. I can imagine
the exact same thing.
This guy did this, that guy did that.
Yeah,
this is
and
bullshit.
So
yeah,
it's frustrating. You know, I have a good time laughing at it, but that's fundamentally not what I want, right?
No, so exactly. This is unproductive as shit. Like, come on, guys. Like,
yeah. And so anyone who has that approach is kind of left out in the cold too, because
that's funny.
You know, how do you intervene? How do you talk about it? And so coming back to the point of like, again, most of what passes for public discourse, whether it's coming from the New York Times or a think tank, is not about the thing. It's not about what people think it's about. And so I realized a long time ago, I think, just how captured and carried we can be by different discourses, different job opportunities, sort of like socio-ecological niches to live and thrive in, right? And that's
look at Glenn Greenwald. I mean, he's the poster child of this, I think, in my eyes, you know, as someone that, like, you broke the Snowden story. Oh my gosh, you are the paragon of free speech and, you know, all this stuff, holding truth to power. And then now it's like, you have like, you literally, I watch what you do, and you just play fights and, you know, but pick fights to just make into this either or thing, which you were just talking about. Another Steven Crowder example, all these other people. So it's interesting that these guys get passed off as this like domain of yes or no, right or wrong, red or blue, you know, all these dichotomies. And that's, I think, maybe one of the other parts of the discourse is that, like, the fact that we're not seeing both in this, like, I mean, I'm not saying both. I don't want to get into the centrism and what, you know, bothism and stuff like that. But at the same time, on some issues, there are ways to go about it, you know, and being honest about it. I mean, Steven Crowder is known for saying, "Change my mind," and it's like, I want to know, has anyone done like a study, like a real study of how many times he has actually changed his mind? Because it's like, and if it's not more times than you haven't, then this isn't interesting. You know what I mean? Because it's like, all the times that you haven't changed your mind, it's like, well, welcome to the fucking club of humanity, man. Like, you're no better than anyone. But then you have a platform saying that you know something and do something different. It's like, I'm not sitting on my high horse saying this either, but like a little bit of you know, intellectual humility is the first step. So
yeah, exactly. And so I had wished that an actual sort of debate or interview took place between Cedar and Crowder, or Ethan, and, you know, that they all just got over the surprise and the joke of it, and actually tried to accomplish something. Because when you look at how they reported on it after the fact, for both of them, they both said that they had the desire to have an actual debate or interview. So they were both accusing each other of bad faith. And to be clear, I mean, you know, it's not equal. Sam Cedar is absolutely more legitimate, more in the right, you know, but there is a critical way to view it, that they both failed to kind of live up to their own ideals of wanting an authentic exchange. And
but then Steven Crowder, but isn't that Ethan guy, like, he's a comic, right? So again, it's like, you alone, you're saying that I'm this intellectual heavyweight and I'm gonna go fight a child. You know what I mean? It's like, wait, what? Like, and then they bring in an actual fighter, and then the child goes, "Hey, now you get to fight him." Like, that's how I saw it. It was like more of like leveling the playing field, because like Steven Crowder, he's not like unintelligent. Like, that's not. No one's saying that. You know what I mean? Like, he knows what he's doing. But yeah, like, the biggest thing I think for me is when I had any interest in the IDW kind of world was watching that debate. With Zizek, Slavoj Zizek and Jordan Peterson. And I like watched it, like I was excited, and then I'm sitting there, and then it's within the first minute, you know, the first opening paragraph, you know, his opening statement, he's basically like, well, this is the first time I'm actually reading it. And it's like, well, wait a second. I've just been listening to you on Joe Rogan and all these other people for a year talk about this, that, and other, and you have been decrying it, and you haven't even read the source material. And it was like, oh my gosh, like, yes, even those people, the highest of the high of public, intelligentsia intellectuals, won't even do the most basic common sense thing to even have it. And it's like, that blew my mind. And if that's what's happening in the current stage, I just started thinking about all the other previous and the past, and I was like, oh, whoa, don't, that's black holes. But let's keep on like the IDW and stuff like that, and maybe the debate with Zizek of something like two heavyweights actually coming up against each other and one clearly not doing the homework,
Yeah, that was very revelatory. And I kind of knew before, it didn't surprise me at all. What did surprise me was actually the admission, the way Peterson went up there, and his opening statement was like, well, I've only read one of Marx's books, and I read it 20 years ago, and here we go. I was like, what? But I knew at the same time that wasn't going to change much, because even though a lot of leftists say like, yeah, Zizek won, kind of mopped the floor with Peterson, or Peterson embarrassed himself, like there was a kind of, measurable change in the temperature of the public discourse or whatever, but nothing fundamentally changed, right? What you had was a lot of Peterson defenders kind of ceding at one point, ceding some territory and being like, okay, yeah, he's kind of wrong about Marxism, but I'm still pro-capitalist.
Right.
So really nothing changed. And yeah.
Is that the same critique then? Maybe this is a good segue into like Game B. Is that kind of the same critique of Game B? Is that like, well, that's an interesting framing, and then maybe you can kind of set it up and stuff, but then it hasn't really had the impact that maybe the framework itself is kind of saying that it should, and then we kind of agree that it should, but then it's not. So then maybe there's some critiques that need to happen fundamentally.
Yeah. So yeah, moving to Game B, it's interesting because I got the chance a couple months ago to have like an anti-debate with Jordan Hall. Okay, so that's on the STOA for their patrons. But
I did listen to your thing with Jim Rutt as well, and like you started pointing back a little, and he was like, "Oh, we're not gonna go." Yeah. But no, I mean, it was a. I at least applaud him. Maybe not some other of the Game B people. At least he gave you at least a platform, talked with you, etc. I don't know exactly your experience on that, but for me as an outsider, it seemed like he was at least wanting to dialogue at some level. So.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about that too, but we'll get to that point after this one. So Peter Lindbergh has this idea of an anti-debate, and it's so interesting because watching Crowder the other day, watching his sort of debrief the day after, Crowder literally used the word anti-debate. Crowder literally said, "What debates, are polarizing. I don't want to have these dunking contests." Like, he was sounding really mature and sort of sincere. And I'll sort of give a bit of credit if it's true. But anyways, Crowder used those terms, anti-debate, and I make that comparison because Peter's anti-debate wasn't that structured and it wasn't that helpful. And Jordan showed up totally unprepared, not reading any of my critiques and sort of being evasive and whatnot. So it was a big disappointment, I think, on all fronts, even my own performance, I can admit. Yeah, so the Game B thing is again, it's salient because they were against critical race theory way before all of this current news blow up over the past month, right? Jim Rutt specifically. And I'm glad that we were able to sort of bury the hatchet and have a conversation, because as an artifact, it shows what's possible. But again, it shows that nothing's changed. Nothing has changed. Jim was, had James Lindsay on the podcast and was kind of, that's his source for this type of attitude about critical race theory and racism in general. And it's a very reactionary source. And Jim, to this day, sticks to that line. Even as news revelations come up, and there's not much that can be done about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, the fact I'm very proud of the encounter nonetheless. The fact that I took the chance to critique Game B and then reached out to Jim to have a conversation which was dependent on not talking about that critique, right? And so I mentioned that in the show, that would actually be a more interesting, more authentic conversation to have. And so part of my heuristic is to look for these boundaries and edges and kind of push up against them and burrow in, because like their idea of a collective intelligence, it's only going to work if we actually recognize the distribution of different skills and knowledge and how they intersect. So there's many things where I would happily defer to these people, like, and where I would seek building agreements. So I think, you know, Jim claims to be sort of post-capitalist in attitude, right? But his way of going around it is more libertarian and mine is more socialist. So, you know, but there's, you know, most public conversations, this is partly why I don't do very many, but why I criticize others so much is because they're rarely getting to the heart of the issue. They're dancing around it.